Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Don being joined by Dylan today. We are live. You're listening to us recorded. It's not a live stream. We're always in a live stream, Dylan, now that I think about that. The problem is that we don't often have all of our listeners in a live stream like we enjoyed last Saturday. And we're still sort of basking in the afterglow of the live stream and the fun that we had there and the feedback from listeners. Dylan had to hurry off before we were done there because he had to go play a gig. So, Dylan, we missed you for the last part of that, but enjoyed the part that you were there. How are you this morning as we record?
Doing well. I've got coffee in front of me. The day is bright. I think we just survived what is kind of left over from the storms that you guys got a few days ago. So my power's on, which is definitely a good thing.
There you go. And if you hear a glitch in the middle of this, it could be because power gets lost here. Those of you know that Houston got hit by a fairly substantial severe thunderstorm event. So we're still, thankfully, no damage of any substance where I am, but know a lot of folks that are impacted. So we'll try to get through without the power, without the lights going out. At least for us, we may put the lights out on some other things in the process of what we do here, but we're going there. So one of the things we were looking at is we have a ton of topics that we've sort of collected over time. And I posted actually something in our Discord channel, Dylan. I think you may have seen it. That's just a subset of that because I stopped being good about tracking that the way that I had been before. I have multiple places to track it. I'm putting it all back in one place. But we probably have 50 or 60 suggested topics that are still floating around out there. Some of them are things you suggested, Dylan, before you even became a member of the team. That gives you an idea where that's at. And then other new suggestions come along. It's not that we didn't like the old suggestions, it's that the new suggestions are, hey, that's cool. Let's do that one kind of thing. So one of the things that happened as a result of the live stream was we had a number of suggestions about topics, and we voted during the live stream. That's how we ended up on the episode that we did. But one of the things we're probably going to do, we've already got them on the short list now. There's now a short list that we've distributed among the team. Are some of those topics coming back around? So they didn't make the live stream, but we thought they were worthy of that. And one of them is the topic that we're going to cover today, which is this idea of, it's sort of a mixed idea, but primarily it's that there's a delayed end to the Reconquista in 1492 and what that means. So Dylan, I'm going to throw the hard part on you here to sort of just, as briefly as possible, because we were just talking about this, neither of us have encyclopedic level knowledge about this part of history, and there's a lot of moving parts, and golly, there's so many of the quote unquote royal families, because they're not even like the big nation states we know now. They're all these various kingdoms on the Iberian Peninsula that go together, and they're all related to each other. But basically, what is the background for where we are in 1492? And then we'll get back to at the end of the Reconquista. Then we'll get back to what our fork is and go from there.
Yeah. So Iberia in the 1400s is a very different place, a much more unsettled place than what we have today. You have the main part of the peninsula divided between three primarily Catholic kingdoms: Portugal, the Kingdom of Castile, and the Kingdom of Aragon. Castile and Aragon will go on to form Spain shortly after this, and basically develop into what we now understand as the Iberian Peninsula. But you've also got this tiny little rump down right at the tip, just east of Gibraltar and kind of running along the coast of the Emirate of Grenada. Sorry, Grenada is an island in South America. The Emirate of Grenada, which is the last sort of holdout of the Muslim, caliphate and the Emirates, who used to control basically the entire Iberian Peninsula before Charles Martel decided to go hammer on the Muslim kingdoms. So Grenada, at this point in 1492, is on its last legs. It's been basically a rump state of Castile, formally separate, but they pay tribute. There's kind of raids back and forth, but they basically are always tippy-toeing around trying to avoid making the big bad dog on the block, the Kingdom of Castile, angry, and finally taking them out. And eventually, in 1492, everybody's favorite Spanish king and queen, Ferdinand and Isabella, finally decide, okay, let's go ahead and get this going. We're going to reunite Iberia. And in January 1492, they finally get the city of Granada to surrender after a few months of fighting at the end, and Granada is taken over and incorporated into the Kingdom of Castile, which is now also basically unofficially unified with Aragon. It's Spain without us actually having the legal entity as Spain at this point. And in 1492, Islam is removed from Iberia and Catholic Europe is basically whole once again. And this basically draws a close to sort of the end of this is basically the last of the era that we know as the Crusades,
Right.
in what you would commonly think of. And this basically also starts the age of exploration. So it's kind of this sort of bookend to one era of history and sort of one way of really thinking about the world and the way that a lot of these European countries and countries throughout the Mediterranean deal with each other, and then switching to sort of a new emerging kind of worldview. So that's sort of where we're at.
It's a paradigm shift for a couple of reasons. The reasons that you've just described, and again that occupation by the caliphates and various Muslim forces goes back like 800 years before. I mean, the battle you're talking about, the Battle of Tours, was in the early 8th century. Was when they sort of stopped the progression, not just up from the Iberian Peninsula, but into France or Gaul at the time. It gets pushed back there. Again, that's before Charlemagne becomes Charlemagne. That's how far back this goes. And then over time, eventually, the way that I think of it, maybe this is the wrong way to think of it, it was inevitable that this would happen, that, sort of the reconquest of the peninsula would happen. But it took a really long time because they were well established there. And you still have to this day in architecture and other ways, you have the influence of the Moors there in Spain and Portugal and on the peninsula, even to this day, in a lot of things that are there. And again, 1492 is an interesting date. Most people, if you just threw that out on the street, would say, "Oh, that's the year Columbus." I'm going to put air quotes here, discovered America, right? But that's why it begins. What, as you were talking about, Dylan, the idea of the age of exploration, even though that's been happening before with the Portuguese working their way around Africa a little bit by a little bit. But again, what Columbus is actually doing when Columbus sails for Spain is he's trying to shortcut the Portuguese. The Portuguese were going the long way around Africa to get to where they get established relationships and ports for the Dune reference here again, the spice that must flow from the east. But it's that critical time. That's why it's the end of one thing, it's the beginning of something else, and all that's happening there, which is why we thought it'd be a fun place to go, and why we like the idea that the topic was suggested, because it's a fun place to be. So I won't say debated, but we explored a lot of different ways to create a fork here, Dylan. And we talked about this during our live stream and the other things there. We normally work really hard. No, that's not true. Sometimes we work really hard, but we at least always try to find what we call a plausible fork, something that's realistic, something that's not just totally out of the blue. We've had exceptions to that, but generally we try to find something that's plausible. So, Dylan, what did we settle on there? Because we came across a whole bunch of different ways. By the way, part of this is also a tribute to Eric Rush, who's not joining us today for this recording, because one of the best ways to create a fork is what, Dylan? What do we got to do to create a fork?
Kill important people.
Somebody's got to die. At the end of the day, somebody's got to die. We're famous for doing that. And again, Secret Service, FBI, whoever is listening, when we talk about killing presidents, we're talking about killing presidents that are already dead. Just so we're clear about that. But we often end up, ending a president when we talk about U.S. situations, because that does it. And here we're going to do it. We're going global. We're going global with our elimination of the important, right, Dylan?
Exactly. We're branching out. We're franchising. Yeah. So basically, the idea is, in order, and somebody posted a proposed fork in the Discord that was pretty good about just sort of a general sort of shift in attitudes. But because we try to hang our hat on sort of really specific stuff, I think we just had to cut it to kind of a more narrow thing. Basically, by 1492, Grenada's on the ropes. There's no changing that in 1492, I don't think. I think by that point, it's just too late. So we have to go further back than that, but keep it close enough to where, it's still a targeted point. So quick kind of detour into the Game of Thrones-esque world of Iberian power politics. you've got the three main kingdoms, Castile, Aragon, and Portugal. They're all basically interrelated. I mean, no offense if we have listeners from Alabama, but if you're from Alabama, you've already heard this joke, so it's not going to make you too mad. This is like the Alabama of Europe right now, before the Habsburgs come on the scene. These people are all intermarried. Ferdinand and Isabella actually were second cousins. I mean, they had to basically bribe the Pope to let them get married. So the way that we could kind of get around Grenada being on the last ropes in 1492 is, what if Isabella was not the one who was on the throne? Fun fact, she actually had a brother who died when he was 14, in 1468. Basically, Isabella's dad, Henry V of Castile, was not super popular with some of his nobles at one point.
Yeah.
He had Alfonso and Isabella. Isabella was the oldest child that Henry had, and then he had Alfonso. Then he got remarried to Joan of Portugal, who was the sister of the King of Portugal. So again, they're all interrelated. And then had another daughter, Joanna. Isabella is not only the oldest kid, but Alfonso, because he's male, and this is medieval Europe, he is more important. There's no real delicate way to get around that. So he, for a while, is the heir presumptive until he dies at the age of 14, either from the plague or some mysterious circumstances. There's no telling. And Isabella becomes the primary heir. So the idea is, what if Isabella dies instead of Alfonso? And where this comes into play is they were both used as puppets by the Castilian nobles who did not like Henry. They're the ones who actually forced Henry to nominate these two as his heirs over his subsequent daughter, Joanna, with the wife of the King of Portugal, because he actually originally wanted her. So the nobles forced Alfonso and Isabella to get priority. The kind of working theory I think we're going on is that Alfonso ended up being sort of killed and knocked off because the Iberian nobles figure Isabella is probably the easier one to manipulate, which is ironic given how we know she turns out later. She's, this real power force and sort of dynamic duo with Ferdinand in the real timeline. But what if the nobles instead decide that Alfonso is the one that they want to keep around and manipulate, and they kill off Isabella? You got one, you don't need both. It's just one more person who's going to fight a succession war with a claim. So let's get her out of the picture. So the short version is, in 1468, Alfonso doesn't die. The nobles decide to kill off Isabella and make Alfonso their puppet. And then what happens from there? So that's the fork.
That's the fork, is in 68. So that puts us roughly
about 30 years before.
Yeah,
like
math in my head,
years.
not my strength. So we're going to go with that being 24 years before. So it's a substantial amount of time. And by the way, if you go Wikipediaing or going down the internet, going down the internet wormholes here, all kinds of fun, interesting rumors, facts/rumors and other things around this history here. For example, one of the questions is whether the Joanna or the Joanna that you referenced, whether she's legitimate or not. There's a whole question about, in fact, I think is he called Henry the Impotent, I think is what he's called.
Yeah, Impotente, I think is his nickname.
Yeah, and anyway, and there's all kinds of questions that relate there. And then one of the questions that actually arises from that, as I was going down, one of the internet rabbit holes, was the fact that how much of that is actually documented history versus rumor, how much of that was sort of propaganda that later Isabella puts out because she wants to diminish Joanna's any claim that she may think that she has, and all the stuff that there. So, to your point, Dylan, in fact, that's why you see so many, this was the theme that I also recognized there. That's why you see so many of these annulments, is they get the permission to marry from the Pope because they're too closely related to do so otherwise. So they get special dispensation. Then something happens down the road and they want to undo the dispensation. See this scenario, see the situation with Henry VIII and and Catherine, all the things that are there. This is like the recurrent theme of, well, it's probably the current theme of Europe forever, particularly Catholic Europe forever, is that. So that's running behind the scenes. So I like this as a point of departure. And so again, we're not arguing here. I just want to clarify this, Dylan. If I misunderstand, let me know. We're not arguing that eventually the quote unquote European powers that we sort of know to be these kingdoms and other things. We're not arguing that they are not eventually going to expel the Islamic influence, the Caliphate influence from the Iberian Peninsula. The argument is that's eventually going to happen. We're just saying it's not going to happen by 1492 because of something we deflected 24 years earlier. And what does that mean? So the reason I sort of want to emphasize this, we're going to be talking a lot about 1492, even though our fork is 24 years before, because what we're doing is delaying what actually happened in 1492. Does that make sense?
Yeah, because basically the reason why 1492 is the year is and Ferdinand and Isabella there wants to do it is because by Isabella being the Queen of Aragon, Castile. I get they're so interrelated. I'm just going to mix them up. Nobody get mad at me for that. Isabella's Castile, Ferdinand is Aragon. Okay, got it. Isabella is the Queen of Castile, and when she marries Ferdinand, they form a union. They're two distinct kingdoms, but they function as one state. If Isabella is not around, Alfonso in the 1400s cannot marry Ferdinand. So that's not going to happen. We keep this tripartite.
That would be a very different fork, by the way, Dylan. That would have been an incredibly different fork.
That papal bribe that they would have to get to make that work is probably going to start the Reformation about 100 years early. Yeah. But basically what that does is that keeps this tripartite tense struggle between the three Catholic kingdoms so that they're still going to be kind of at each other's throats or worried about each other, stabbing each other in the back, because there's all this political jockeying between the three of them, so that in the 1470s, 80s, and 90s, they're not going to sort of be agreed and sort of have this kind of truce or détente where they can focus on the Muslims in Granada. They're going to be much more concerned about each other, so that the Granadans, who are in this kind of real period of instability themselves. I mean, they've been on, like I keep saying, they've been on the ropes for years, but they just cannot get their act together, except kind of right as Granada's under siege. And at that point, it's too late to do anything. So by keeping the Spanish kingdoms from basically banding together and getting on the same page, the Granadans have a little bit of breathing room. They can get their kind of sea legs under them. Do they last another 50 years, 100, 150? I mean, at a certain point, they're either, even if they aren't militarily wiped out, they're just going to kind of just be stuck there, sitting there. So the idea is just sort of, we don't even really have to figure out how long we delay it. As long as we can say it gets delayed by 30, 40, 50 years, which is probably pretty realistic, we're fine. After that, we don't have to get into the details of sort of when it goes down. Just know that it pushes by a few decades.
Yeah. And then the other thing I think about that, we were talking about this, is also aligns with events further east in the rough time frame here, which is the final fall of Constantinople, Byzantium. The reason it's called Istanbul today is we finally have the eastern half of the Roman Empire finally comes to an end and falls under it. The thing that fascinates me when I just see the maps, this is going back now, jumping back, but to allow to jump forward, when you see the explosion, and that's the best way I know to describe it, in the 100 years post Muhammad, as the caliphates just literally explode out from where they are, and eventually blow up and coming all the way to Iberia. And then, of course, the Crusades are a later thing that sort of pushes that back, which, by the way, most of the time when they went over to fight to regain the Holy Land, when Christians went, they fought the other Christians that were there as much as they fought the actual folks that they were trying to displace. That's a whole interesting, I've been spending some time in the last year studying the Crusades, which is a hard thing to do and a hard thing to grasp. And it's like, wait a second, you went for this, but you did this. What's that about, kind of deal? But the reason I say that is, there is the possibility that if Granada can hold on for a little bit, they may get the support of now an expanding early Ottoman Empire in such a way that, yes, they can hold on, or maybe they become a protectorate under that, or something happens that means that, the thing that popped into my head, Dylan, was this idea of, imagine an Islamic Hong Kong almost, on the Iberian Peninsula, that's being supported by this power further east that has the ability to do so in such a way. And by the way, why would that happen? in much the same way that Hong Kong existed and exists today, trade. You pick up the benefit of what's passing through there as a result of that.
Yeah, because I do really, that idea kind of interests me because that's one of the reasons for the eventual decline of the Ottoman Empire is because they get circumvented. Because primarily, where the Ottomans sit, that's why the Byzantines were so powerful for so long before the rise of Islam, is because they sit on this center between the Bosporus and the Red Sea and sort of what will become the Suez Canal. Is this, you're basically blocking off the entire Silk Road. You are essentially the functional wall between Europe and, quote unquote, the Orient, where all of the cool stuff comes from. If you're a European monarch who's desperate for pepper and
Right.
silk. So if the Ottomans have, just for the sake of, discussion, we'll say like a Granadan protectorate in Iberia, that's why the Portuguese are trying to go around Africa and get to the Orient, because they don't want to have to keep paying the Ottomans to get all their stuff. But if the Ottomans are, and at this point, the Portuguese are going around Africa. Like
Right.
Henry the Navigator's already been around. They've got ships going all over the place. There's no real stopping that. But if Granada is under the sort of the protection of the Ottomans, the Portuguese at least are going to have a harder time doing that, and the Ottomans are going to be able to run interference and take a little slice of that pie, because now they have access to sort of Western Africa and everything that lies to the west of that, foreshadowing for what we'll get to probably in 10 minutes.
Yeah. I just again, it's one of these things, which is often the case. It's not surprising. This is what happens when you change histories that has ripples. But again, as you talked about, it's this confluence of a lot of things that's going on at this particular point of time. So the one rock dropping in the pond there ripples across that pond. Oh, by the way, and there's several streams in a bayou and a creek that it ripples across at the same time. And it's trying to figure out almost where you stop it, because once you start the ripples, they just keep going and going and going and going. And I've always been intrigued once I became familiar with Henry the Navigator as a persona in history. Just about, the Portuguese do eventually, have an influence in the quote unquote New World. Again, Columbus not discovering it, but reopening it, so to speak. But it's nowhere close to the influence that the Spanish have. And they don't end up with the quote unquote better parts of the New World in terms of the wealth that's going to flow to Spain. But, Portugal had established, by hopping around Africa on both sides and hopping up, they had established this route. And so the idea of a Portugal that is much more leading the age of exploration post 1492, because there's not as much of the Spain that we know in the real timeline there, is incredibly intriguing to me, Dylan. That's what's intriguing there, because then you jump not only from, we've already talked about the influence in Europe, we talked about the influence in, I'm going to call it the Middle East. It's that confluence area there where the Ottoman Empire sits. I don't know what else to call it except the Ottoman occupied territory. But now you skip across the Atlantic to having impact over there.
And here's a bit of trivia that I'm just going to throw like a giant boulder in a pond and leave for Alexis, because the English get pulled in here too.
Yeah.
So if I'm gonna fully admit this is kind of a tangent, but just bear with me. So if Isabella and Ferdinand don't marry, Alfonso is the king of Castile. What will eventually happen, because part of Henry's deal when he nominated Alfonso as the heir apparent was his preferred daughter, Joan, was going to marry him. So that way the daughter he actually wanted to be queen was going to be queen either way. Joan's related to the King of Portugal. So at some point down the line, most likely, Portugal is now going to be related with Castile. So instead of quote unquote Spain, you're going to have an Iberia that has probably a kingdom of Portugal. And then if we've got any Catalonian listeners, they're going to be real happy with this, because they're going to basically have the Kingdom of Aragon as an independent thing, and we're going to have Super Portugal basically on the Iberian Peninsula. And Joan's great-grandfather was John of Gaunt, who was one of the earliest leaders of the House of Lancaster. So, and this is the boulder that I'm just going to throw in the lake and walk away and let the ripples go where they may. I'm really curious to see just any weird ideas that people have about this on the Discord. England and Portugal have this hugely long-standing alliance what if this super Portugal, because they're dynastically related to the House of Lancaster, decide to eventually meddle in English dynastic succession? Because, and I don't remember off the top of my head when the War of the Roses hits, but I'm pretty sure it's after this. So, do the Portuguese decide to start interfering, and does the sort of old alliance of England and Portugal go by the wayside too? Tangent over, done. That's just kind of a fun little bit of trivia. I'm curious to see what Alexis thinks of that.
Yeah, I'm sure she will have some thoughts on that, as will our listeners. And again, plug here again for the Discord channel. That's exactly what we love about our Discord, is the ability to get sort of feedback on this in real time and throw out some thoughts like, oh, we didn't think about that. Well, we should have thought about that, kind of thing. That's the fun part of what's there. But I agree. And then it quickly plays back into, because the dynamics there are not just political, they are political in Europe, but dynamics there are about to become religious and political. And so, for example, why we eventually end up with, to me, one of the most notable events, the Spanish Armada, is because we have Catholic Spain, who has plenty of resources because of the New World part, the wealth that's flown from the New World, is on behalf of the other Catholic powers, but also on behalf of the papacy, is taking care of those Protestant quote unquote heretics over there in England and addressing that. To your point, if there's a different dynamic, there's Super Portugal aligned with England, the things that are going on, I can see all kinds of possibilities there. And again, those are all paths for exploration down the road that are sort of interesting, because we talked about this off podcast, Dylan, is that I think it is almost impossible to underestimate how important the flow of wealth from the New World, specifically to Spain, was in the period after Columbus's voyages, and what happens in the next, again, that 30 to 50 year period that you're talking about there is where it fully develops out. Spain doesn't exist as Spain, as we've talked about before. They're separate kingdoms that haven't really united into that until we have Ferdinand and Isabella. But then once they're united, super fueled by the wealth that's flowing from the New World. And so, again, one of the points of departure, this is what I like to talk about next. So if we delay the Reconquista being completed in 1492, one of the things that it did allow in the regular timeline was Spain to sponsor Columbus's voyage. Columbus is not Spanish. That's an important thing to understand. He is not a native Spaniard or someone who is from one of the kingdoms that will become Spain sailing on behalf of his flag. He's a guy for hire. He's looking for whoever will fund this thing, because again, his thinking is there's no North America standing in the way. If we sail west, we can get east. That's his point. And Spain is able to, although the whole thing about her hawking her jewels and all that, that's a whole other fun thing. Too much of my history comes from watching Bugs Bunny cartoons that adapt history too, now that I think about it, but that whole thing, I think, is far less likely if they're still dealing with what's going on the peninsula. They are much less in a position to be able to fund Columbus's. It's a modest funding. I mean, it's 3 ships and one guy and 3 ships going off, but it still required the support of somebody, and that support happened to come from Spain.
Yeah, and it's because they're kind of at I'm going to say each other's throats. They're not like trying to really off each other, but because you have Castile and Aragon not unifying, the question becomes, okay, well, Columbus is going to go all over the place trying to get somebody to do this, because this is sort of his kind of madcap, Doc Brown crazy scheme. So where's he going to go? Well, the logical choice would be the people who have, by this point, already found a way by going around Africa to the New World. Especially if Portugal is, on the road to unifying or being much more friendly with Castile, they may be much more continually focused on seeing, the trade in the New World, because now they don't have to worry on their eastern flank about this big Castile, Aragon, whatever's going on that they may have to keep some forces and some money committed to. So, it's probably pretty likely, and I think he actually did at one point in our timeline at least reach out. It's probably pretty likely that Columbus, instead of sailing from Cadiz in Castile, he just goes right up to Lisbon and decides to get some funding, some ships, from there and basically continue. Does he go exactly the way he goes? But he probably does get hired by Portugal. And then Portugal becomes this sort of, king of the New World instead of the Spanish.
Yeah. Or alternatively, and I think that's the likely scenario. That's what I think that is most interesting in terms of the way that it has ripples. The other scenario is he doesn't find a willing benefactor, and that's the two events of 1492 are both delayed. The Reconquista is delayed. Columbus is delayed again. That didn't have to be a couple of years or a decade, and suddenly, because they're not the only ones that are sailing around. Again, the Portuguese have on their own. I think I actually did an episode about like the accidental discovery of the New World by the Portuguese, because they just get in the South Atlantic, get blown across pretty easily and find South America there. And then the other possibility is, England, last time I checked, is a maritime nation and becomes even more so. So you might have the English, and the way that our real timeline played out, which is why this is different, is the English came, the Dutch came, the Portuguese came, the Spanish came. It was not limited to the French came. It was not limited to any one European power once the realization was, hey, there's something over there to get to and you can get there and not die. It's fast enough to get to that you can make it. Is that where they ended up landing in the New World and the nature of who they were made a big difference. England did not land in and suddenly go marching off to take gold from Montezuma. They didn't have that as a choice. They interacted with North American natives where they were, and the French eventually did. The French, the French. I remember having a history teacher at some point say, the French got furs, the Spanish got gold, and that made a difference in terms of how it played out.
Yeah, and the thing you have to remember is too. So if regardless of whether it's, England or Portugal or whoever, what you don't have is you don't have the two sort of premier Catholic exploring nations kind of economically competing with each other. You know what happens 2 years after 1492? The Treaty of Tordesillas.
Yeah.
So in a world where you don't have Catholic Spain and you have Portugal as the sole Western power, not only do we completely upset the template for what we know as the colonization of the Americas, you also leave the the East Indies, Indonesia, India, all of that completely up for grabs.
Right. But and the Treaty of Tordesillas is really just a ratification and slight alteration of a papal bull. Right? I mean, at the end of the day, the treaty comes from the Pope saying this is how we're going to divide the world. Then there's an argument about over what that is, and so they formalize it in the form of that treaty, moving the line a little bit because of keeping some things inside of it, not realizing that they were creating other issues when they moved the line. That's a whole other thing. That's how you get, there's this thing called Brazil. It sticks that far east. How do we deal with that kind of thing? Is because that always I have this bad problem of being an American, of thinking about North and South America being aligned in a north-south way, very vertical, and they're not. South America offsets much further east than you immediately think about, particularly as you're pushing out, the part of Brazil, that modern-day Brazil, that sticks out there. But you're right, is that, first of all, if it's not two competing Catholic powers, at this point in the late 15th century, they're all still Catholic because the Reformation hasn't happened yet, but it's coming. But you don't have the bull, you don't have the treaty, and then you don't have the New World being divided that way. And if the Portuguese are the first to come and there's nobody else really to compete as effectively for that part of it, it may even be more pronounced. We wouldn't be talking about the Spanish main, we'd be talking about the Portuguese main when we're talking about the Caribbean, basically, at that point.
And assuming we have Granada sticking around, you have to remember that, at this point, there are Muslim, rulers all over, not just the south of Spain, but also all of North Africa. So the Granadans are already going to be going through the Straits of Gibraltar and going around, and the Ottomans too, a little bit, if we have a Granadan protectorate.
Right.
It was just like how you talked about how Brazil is a lot further east than people think it is. I mean, that's how the Portuguese found it. So what's to say that if the Portuguese are more focused on heading, in a Columbus-style straight west adventure, the Granadans are already going to be on the coast of Africa. So what's to say that they aren't taking some exploratory ventures and swinging down, you might actually end up having sort of a, and it's hard to say exactly what, because the colonization is going to be totally different, especially, not just because the Spanish are out of the picture, but because you have sort of completely different worldviews going on in terms of, sort of the Islamic North African countries versus, Christian Europe. But who's to say that there's not going to be, some sort of Granadan or Ottoman trade colony in, what we would now know as Brazil?
Right.
What's that going to do? And now it's not just a political economic competition, but it's also a religious competition for converts in the New World.
Yeah. In the real timeline, religion doesn't play into things until much later and in a very different way, in terms of the different way, with a lot of the English settlement coming as a result of religious groups that are fleeing real or perceived persecution, most of it real persecution. You're the one who's not being allowed to do what you want to do. It's persecution to you, right? Whether it's the same type of persecution we may attach to that word otherwise. But you're right. Change the dynamic. And to me, the fascinating part about that, Dylan, is that even today, as I understand, I've never been there. I'd love to go. Even as I understand today, the influence that still exists architecturally and other ways from the occupation of the Iberian Peninsula for a long period of time by the Caliphate, and the fact that there was this interplay there between Muslims and Christians in a way that's different in a lot of other places in Europe, at least at that period of time, created some unique cultural things. It created some unique things that were going on there. And again, you mix some ingredients somewhere else in the world with a different dynamic, and it could it'll just turn out differently. I don't know if it turns out better or worse. It just turns out differently. And the one thing I do know is that this goes back to the Crusades. This goes all the way back. We're about to have, post 1492 in Europe, a series of religious wars that are contained within Christendom. It's Catholics and Protestants of various flavors, and the Crusades, as you point out, are sort of over for the most part in terms of the major wars that are there. But what happens if you have a flare up of, again, maybe more unified Christian forces because of things that go differently now in Europe against Islamic occupation somewhere else in South America? More of perhaps what happens in the eastern side of Asia before it's all said and done there, because eventually you do have Islam spread in that direction. It's just in a different timeline, in a different way. I think it's fascinating to just, again, I don't know if we've decided anything here. We've just sort of explored all the ripples and here's the map. Here's all the alternatives. Which one do you want to go down? That's the question. Which one do you want to go down? It's a big thing.
Yeah, and that's the beauty about 1492, because there's just so many things that are happening around here. And if you just change, any one of, not even just something like this, but if you just change one of any number of small little things, this is, kind of one of the most pivotal periods for what we understand as the modern development of the world. There's a handful of sort of, periods of decades that do that. The religion thing, I know we try not to get too, political or, theological on this podcast, but just from a historical perspective, the religion one really is fascinating to think about what happens, because you've got what are eventually going to be, the Christian wars of religion between Protestants and Catholics and the Counter Reformation and all of that. Who's a kid? He's 9 years old when Grenada falls in our timeline. Now, Martin Luther's probably not going to hear a whole lot of stories over in Germany regardless, but you have to imagine that, Martin Luther or somebody like him growing up in this alternate, late 15th century, early 16th century, where you start hearing stories about the Ottomans and the Muslims, bringing all this fantastical new trade back. You have to wonder what that dynamic is going to do in terms of changing, not just if the Reformation takes place, what it takes place over, but, the very sort of foundations of that allow it to take place.
Right.
What that's going to do, even with the same players, because, Martin Luther's around, but does he, instead of a reformer, does he decide to be, kind of a hardline anti-Islamic, kind of internal reformer instead of what ends up being an external reformation.
Right.
The dominoes are just hard to predict.
Yeah, and the argument that's there, and I have spent just for lots of reasons, time in this, and again, the seeds of the Reformation have already been planted. 100 years before, roughly, there's Huss and others that have come along, that are already touting things that eventually Luther will tout, and then you have the question of what was Luther's motivation. I personally believe, this is my belief, Luther's motivation was to reform the church that he knew. His intent was not ever to form a separate, to separate. It eventually came to that. But, where we get the conflict eventually is by the time the conflict really erupts. I mean, the religious element of this is really interesting for two reasons. What's going on in a different form of England, where there's not a reason to do what is essentially yes, it's religious. It's a political reformation. That's my take on the English Reformation. And Henry, Henry carried the title Defender of the Faith because most of his thoughts were very, very, very Orthodox Catholic before it was convenient to not be, because, and again, he had a lot of elements inside of England that had different thoughts, but before it was not to be because he needed an annulment, he needed a new wife.
And who was Henry's wife that he was trying to get divorced from?
Which is the point. It's uber Catholic Isabella's daughter.
Yeah. So Catherine of Aragon is now not even, there will be a kid from Iberia who's probably in the picture. There's only so many, royal houses to go around. But, is England even in the position where they have to do that? Does Henry just, regardless of who is the one who is presenting the fertility problems in that relationship, whoever Henry ends up marrying, do they even present the issues that allow the Anglican Church to become a thing?
Right.
If Henry has a kid by his first wife, he doesn't have to worry about it.
If he has a male child by Catherine, this is the subject of many episodes. I can put a list easily because it goes all the way back to our second episode. No round tables. There we have Arthur living so that you don't end up with Henry as king to begin with. But Catherine bore Henry a child, just not a male one. And so so if you change that dynamic at all, or if you just change who it is, we know now that the sex is determined by the father, not the mother. So we understand how that works biologically now, but maybe it works slightly differently, with somebody else. The timing works differently or whatever the case is there. And, there's not maybe the same thing there. Of course, I guess the point with Catherine was it wasn't that they were too close by relation, but they needed the dispensation. It was the fact that she had married to or was betrothed to his brother, and that whole thing. The Leviticus argument is how it goes down there versus something different. But you're right, Dylan. And in where I was going, I detoured myself. I saw a squirrel and I chased it. Is that part of what happens by the time the Reformation comes to be in the early 16th century? Is you now have that wealthy Spain that is capable of funding and doing the things that are necessary to support that half of the religious wars that are going on now between Catholics and Protestants of various ilks. Is Portugal in the same position? Probably. Maybe they take on the same role if the wealth is flowing there, but maybe it's something different. Or if there's more of the relationship between, again, now not Spain, a Spanish princess being married to an English monarch. Now it's a Portuguese princess that's married to an English monarch. Does that change how that goes down in terms of what's going on there? And the one thing I do know, this is the influence of Isabella. This is why changing her changes a lot. To call her an uber Catholic is not an understatement by any stretch of the imagination. They were all, for the most part, particularly the monarchs in Europe, were very positioned relative to the papacy the way they were and the Catholic Church for the reasons that they were, church and state not being separated. But even inside of that, while they're all aligned, and Catholic again means universal, right? It's the universal church. But there, or inside of that, Isabella is off to the right end of that spectrum. If you just want to use a left-right spectrum, there is Joe. Pick one. Pick any of your monarchs from Iberia that are in the situation otherwise. Are they quite as adamant about theology and doctrine as she was, and is the context that that's in, meaning it's not as important?
And so one other thing that I've been kind of thinking about in the background is you also have to remember, so, and I don't mean to keep going back to the Reformation, but one of the immediate inciting incident for Luther's 95 Theses was this whole issue of indulgences. The Pope was trying to do all those indulgences to rebuild St. Peter's Basilica because
Right.
it had kind of fallen apart as a result of the popes being in Avignon during all of that hot mess during the early 1400s. So here's where I'm going with this. If you have the Ottomans and the Granadans kind of keeping, more of a position in the Mediterranean, especially assuming that you have people like Suleiman and some of the other, Ottoman emperors and caliphs still continuing into the Balkans, does the Pope even want to go back to Rome for any extended period of time? If you have the sort of South Mediterranean being kind of more of a Muslim lake, so to speak, or does he hightail it back to Avignon? And does that then not necessitate the rise of the indulgences? And does that then put France in more of a premier position in terms of papal influence?
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things that could be
Yeah.
that could ripple off from this.
I agree. And it gets thorny and complicated there because as soon as you talk about religion in France, you've just introduced a whole new component there because it's not as unified as other nations are. Germany's the other place that I go there in terms of having different, viewpoints when you get down to the theology of the Reformation. Certainly the French, at one point I think there's 29 different people named Henry that are claiming the French throne. That's the way that I think about it in my head. And some of the Henry of Guise and Henry of this and Henry of that are all there. A lot of Henrys running around in Europe. That's a whole other thing that we could talk about as well. But you're exactly right in terms of what is again, the Catholic Church, the Pope has been in Rome for the vast majority of the existence of that. By the way, a little bit of a shout out for a future episode. We're going to tackle one of the other topics, which is what happens if Constantine doesn't convert. That's a whole other thing that I'll tease there a little bit. But this, there was the period of the quote unquote Babylonian captivity of the papacy, the Avignon situation, and yes, historically, for the most part, the Pope has been a resident of Rome and the Vatican. But if you go for longer, or there's a good reason to not be there because of the safety and security, eventually when we talk about things, we're not talking about a Pope in Rome, we're talking about a Pope in Avignon, we're talking about a Pope in Paris. Again, what's going on there. And to your point, the trigger event, the gunpowder was out. The fuel had been poured, but the trigger event for Luther to say enough is enough was the selling of indulgences and what that meant and all the things that were there. That was that was the spark that lit something that was already ready to ignite for a lot of other reasons.
Yeah, and you have to remember that assuming or since we've already completely redone colonization, the piece of the pie that France gets might completely change. Beaver pelts may give way to Mexican gold mines or something. And then if you have more money, and this is just wild hypothetical, if you have more money coming into France, they can become, even if it's not on the same level as the Spanish silver money or what Portugal's going to end up getting, France's immediate role as sort of a power broker could completely change as well. So just the whole political scape of Europe for what ends up being basically the foundation of the modern era completely changes.
I agree. I don't know if we answered anything, Dylan. But we did raise some really, really good questions, I think. And I think if nothing else, while we didn't talk about a specific timeline moving forward necessarily, sometimes we get focused on a particular road that we're going to take. We basically just said, oh, we're here at the confluence of all these roads. We're in the traffic. This is the traffic circle of historical Europe to some degree. Pick your branch and go down it almost type of thing, or be the Griswolds from European Vacation.
I was going to say we took the Fork in Time Winnebago and we're on the roundabout and we're just throwing stuff out the window as we go.
Yeah, and I have that scene from European Vacation. I can't they can't get left. They keep coming around and seeing the same things going around. If you know what I'm talking about there, oh, look, Big Ben. Oh, look, da da da, and that kind of thing happening. To me, it is one of those juncture moments in time that again, one the suggested change here, what if you just delay the Reconquista? And of course, we had to go back and do that, by doing something previous to that. We talked about why we do that. But 1492 was a pivotal, or that period particularly, but 1492 in our real time was a pivotal year because it was a pivotal year. There's a lot of things in pivot there. And it is one of those unique periods in time, I think, where, unlike a lot of other things, this has become my take on history, primarily as a result of doing the podcast, is that it's really hard to divert the big flows. The flow is there because the flow is there, and you can change the path of the river a little bit, but it's going to the ocean, kind of thing. I think this is one of those times, though, when you can really make some diversions just because you have multiple influences that are close enough together that the way that they can compound upon each other exacerbates the whole situation, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that's the right way to put it.
Yeah. And again, at the risk of overemphasizing this, don't underestimate the fuel, which is the wealth coming from the New World. Don't underestimate what that does. The question is, whose tank does that go in, and what are they able to do with it? And more importantly, what do they want to do with it? Eventually, it becomes Spain as the defender of the faith, the Catholic component of the religious wars, spending a lot of the money for that and the politics that works out of that. The other nice benefit from this, I think you mentioned in some of the notes that you passed on, and Dylan, I should post Dylan's notes on the Discord. With your permission, Dylan, I may do that because there's all kinds of fun stuff in there. But one of the things you had mentioned there was no Habsburg influence in Spain, perhaps, and so at some point we don't have a bunch of weak-chinned people that are monarchs.
I was going to say the single greatest contribution of this timeline is the removal of Habsburg chin jokes from the universe.
There you go.
Austria still falls at some point, but Habsburg chin is not a joke.
There you go. All right. Anything else we missed there? I mean, we missed everything, Dylan, because again, we could have gone all kinds of places. But anything you think that was super important to get out there before we close this one down?
No, other than the disclaimer, if this is what happens when you leave Dylan and Don unsupervised with nobody else to watch.
Send nannies or babysitters, or this is what you will get. So I should mention we expected to have a couple of members of the team, and they had issues with illnesses and other things, so they couldn't join us. But Dylan, it's been a while since you and I did a solo. We've done a couple before, but this is a duo. This is the little while since just been the two of us, so I've enjoyed doing it. I miss the rest of the team, but sometimes it's nice to and just I'll just mention this. We talked about this along the live stream and off with the team. Probably we're going to break up into smaller teams a little bit more frequently in the future, where we may be. We have these recording times where generally we record at the same time we normally do it. Whoever can come for that, but if we have enough, we may break into two teams. So you'll see a little bit more of the 2-3 kind of thing, where there may be 6 people recording from the Fork in Time team at that moment in time, but Team A is tackling one topic and Team B is tackling something else. So I think you'll see that a little bit more. Dylan, as always, enjoy it, and we will basically close this down with what we always do, my normal closeouts. If you haven't visited the website, please do so. I'm going to mention again that we have consolidated the feeds for The Room Where It Happened and A Fork in Time. So the result of that is, I released something earlier, but if you didn't listen to that, if you're a listener who skipped over that, the archive for The Room Where It Happened has moved to our Patreon page, but they are free there. So you can go and listen to those episodes if you've never listened to The Room Where It Happened there. Moving forward, they will start being released here. So if you've never been exposed to that show, which is just a different concept about what we do, we don't talk about the what if, we just talk more about the what did, and feel freer to do that. You'll see that there. We kind of know, I think, where our next episode is going to go there, and I think that's going to be a lot of fun. It relates to some things we've been doing. And then the other thing we've mentioned a number of times is the Discord. Come there. We get good feedback. We post these episodes almost immediately, and already from the episode that posted yesterday, the feedback is coming in about this, that, and the other. So it's there, and that's a good place to go. So Dylan, do we have any suggestions for our listeners who happen across a fork in time? What do we think they ought to do?
Mail it to Eric Rush, since we've taken the first king that can be killed, and let him kill an emperor with it.
Fair enough. It works. Thanks, guys. Talk to you soon.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.